Hey everybody, we are ready to start period 6 of the AP US History curriculum, which means we are on the downhill slope, believe it or not. There are 9 periods we have to cover in our curriculum, and we're up to 6. It's a big deal, right? We're over halfway there, and it's a good feeling to know we have a lot of ground behind us, and we still have a lot of things to cover, of course, but there's an end in sight, we'll say. Anyhow, so in period 6, we're going to look at America and how it's changing post-Civil War. This is going to take us all the way up basically to the turn of the century. And our first topic today is going to be westward expansion. And specifically, we're going to look at some economic changes. We'll do some more westward expansion in topic 6.3 as well, but that'll be more like Indian Wars and things like that. So let's try to get into this topic and see what's going on in the western areas. So we're looking at the causes and effects today of the settlement of the West from 1877, that's the end of Reconstruction, until 1898, that's the Spanish-American War. Not a lot of time, right? We're talking, what, 21 years or something that we're looking at, but even so, there's a lot going on in that short amount of time. We're going to begin by looking at the farmers and talk a little bit about agriculture being mechanized. Now, this is not the first time we looked at this topic this year. We looked at it back in the early 1800s with things like the John Deere plow and Cyrus McCormick's reaper and all that stuff. And the mechanization continued past that point, only accelerated and got more and more efficient. And with that increase in mechanization, what we're going to see is agricultural production just skyrocket in the second half of the 1800s. Now, that's good for consumers because, of course, that means the food prices go down. Not so good for the farmers, however. The farmers are the ones who are they're not making as much money as they used to on their crop. And we're going to look at some of the problems facing farmers as we go through this topic. But let's first talk about farming as a business. Now, remember, we've kind of left behind the days of the subsistence farmer, out there feeding, or growing rather, all the crops he needs to feed his family and making their clothing at home and all. That's. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but it's not the main part of farming as we get to the late 1800s. Instead, mechanization really has taken over. We've got big, bulky, expensive new technologies that are very efficient, things like a steam tractor, the combine, which combines the reaping and threshing component. So this is kind of like the next evolution of the McCormick reaper we saw in the early 1800s. But with all these new technologies, of course, comes big costs, big investments that farmers are getting themselves into, which means they take out a lot of loans, which means, of course, they are heavily in debt and tied to the banks. As we talked about a few moments ago, food prices are falling, which is good for consumers but bad for farmers. And as prices continue to fall, it's more and more difficult for farmers to pay back those loans. And of course, if you can't pay back your loan, ultimately, your farm could be foreclosed on, and you find yourselves basically homeless and really kind of at a loss. And it's not just human-made problems. We also have Mother Nature. The late 1800s, we're going to see a lot of droughts and floods. And it's a tough time to be a farmer for sure. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, farmers also find themselves kind of the victim of big business, in the sense that they become very dependent on businesses like the railroad, because the railroad is how they export their crops to market. It's how they import all the goods they need to survive, and all those things they're purchasing, whether it's a new plow or barbed wire or fertilizer for the farm, all that equipment, all those goods, they all come from industries that were dominated by monopolies. And we're going to talk a lot more about monopolies and what they called trusts later in period 6. But obviously with a monopoly, there's not a lot of competition going on, which means prices tend to be high. So again, to kind of put ourselves back in the shoes of a farmer, you're paying high prices for all the stuff you need, but you're getting low prices for the stuff that you produce. And that's not a system that can continue long term. So we've got some pretty unhappy farmers, some desperate farmers, and while I'm sure some of them were probably envisioning maybe turning to violence, we're We're going to avoid that. And short of violence, how can farmers make their voices heard? And the answer, of course, is they've got to get politically organized. So what we're going to see is in the late 1800s, a series of new farming organizations are going to pop up. Now, some of these are more social, some of them are more political, some of them are kind of both, but these are on the local scale and also the regional scale. So let's look at our first of these farming organizations. It's called the Greenback Labor Party. Now, greenback is a term you may not be familiar with. It's kind of an antiquated synonym for currency. And the reason they call it the greenback was this currency that was printed during the Civil War was printed with green ink, and people just started calling currency greenbacks. So the Greenback Labor Party, excuse me, what they want is they're demanding inflation. Now, this is something we've looked at, we're going to continue to look at. It's kind of a weird concept, but if you are in debt, inflation is actually a good thing. And the reason inflation is a good thing when you're in debt is your debt doesn't inflate. Okay, it's kind of stationary, it's locked in. But as a farmer, if prices go up because of inflation, you're going to have more money to pay down those debts. And one way to inflate the currency is to basically print lots and lots and lots of money. So that's what they're encouraging to happen. And, you know, this is a pretty serious party. It's a regional party, yes, but it's a serious one. They're going to get 14 people elected to Congress. So this is, again, not some fluke party. They've got some real political power behind them. Our next organization is called the Grange. So the Grange was not so much political, at least in its origins. It was more a social organization, kind of like a fraternal organization, where you think about a lot of these farmers, they're living out in remote farms. They don't really see a whole lot of other people besides their family. You might go weeks without seeing anybody, and frankly, it's kind of lonely. And so the Grange helps organize community events so people can come and socialize and, just kind of participate, create a sense of unity. And by 1875, there's almost 1 million members of the Grange. And there, just a poster here from the Grange, kind of expressing how important farming is, right? All these people, they're doing stuff, sure, but if it's not for the farmer, no one's getting fed. So the Grange was, again, social, but it's also economic. They came to the conclusion that if you have a bunch of farmers together, what they can do is, instead of being reliant on a business, they can kind of pool their resources and cooperatively open businesses and grain elevators so that any profits are shared among the members. And because it's not necessarily even seeking a profit, these cooperative stores can keep prices very, very low. And the Grangers are going to get political ultimately as well. They're particularly powerful in the upper Midwest. They're going to pass a series of laws known as Granger Laws. And these Granger Laws are trying to make life easier on farmers by keeping down grain storage fees and also railroad rates. That way, again, the farmers are keeping more money in their own pocket and not giving it out to big business. All right, our next organization is called the Farmers Alliance. It's a, pretty obvious name, what they're all about. This is going to be started in Texas in the late 1870s, so about a decade after the Civil War. And much like the Grangers, the Farmers Alliance, they're going to set their sights on the railroads and big business. They're trying to work together and break down those high prices. It's kind of like a labor union in that you as an individual don't have a lot of power, but as a group of workers, you can demand higher wages. Well, in this case, the farmers, the more farmers you have cooperatively working together, the better prices you can demand from the businesses, and you can sell your grain at higher rates. Like the Grange, this is going to really spread like wildfire, particularly over the South and the Great Plains. And by 1890, there's something like 1 million members in the Farmers Alliance. Now, we can't go too far without talking about what a group left out. Remember, the Farmers Alliance is particularly powerful in the South And so I think we can kind of predict, being this is late 1800s, we're not going to see a lot of black farmers. In fact, there are no black farmers allowed in the Farmers Alliance. They're kept out. Also, if you're a white sharecropper, you couldn't qualify for membership. Or if you're a farm worker but not an owner of a farm, you're also disqualified. So the Farmers Alliance was a little bit more, a little pickier, I guess, with their membership. They wanted to have people on the rolls they saw as, powerful enough to actually have an impact on farming policy across America. However, we had a sort of an analogous party set up, or organization set up, called the Colored Farmers National Alliance, of which eventually there's about 250,000 members by 1890. All right, so now we're going to move on to what is going to be probably the most important of all these organizations in terms of its impact and its longevity. It's known as the People's Party, better known by its nickname, the Populists. So the Populists are making a lot of the same demands we've been talking about. They want more control over railroads. In fact, they were even demanding that the government nationalize big businesses. And to nationalize, all that means is the government literally takes over private businesses and runs them so that private individuals are not making profit off them. Rather, the government, in theory, could lower the price of goods and services through these big businesses. They also wanted to see what's called a graduated income tax. What this would mean is the more you earn, the more you pay in taxes, which of course is something we have today. And that's something that the Populists were very much in favor of. In their minds, you had a lot of rich businessmen not paying enough taxes, and they felt that, that they should be pulling their own weight. You also see a demand from the Populists for inflation. Again, we talked about this. Inflation favors people who are in debt. And so that makes sense that they would like to see this because they represent a lot of farmers. And the way they're going to achieve this is not by printing paper money, but rather putting more silver dollars into circulation, okay? Coinage of silver. And this idea of coining silver and inflating the currency is something we are going to come back and revisit several times. We're not over with this topic, in other words. All right, one member of the Populist that I want you to remember, she's from Kansas, and Kansas was kind of like the hotbed of populist activities. Obviously, lots of farmers in Kansas. She was quite an outspoken individual. Remember, this is a time period where women didn't have the right to vote. However, they are becoming more politically active, and Mary Elizabeth Lease definitely fits that category. She was outspoken supporter of women's suffrage. She was for temperance, in other words, restriction or even elimination of alcohol, and she loved the Populists. She was called the Kansas Pythoness, also referred to as Patrick Henry and Petticoats. And her famous quote referring to Kansans, she said, "Kansas should raise less corn and more hell." Right? Get out there and demand things get changed. Okay, now we're going to move on and move away from those organizations and focus on transportation and settlement patterns. And to understand what we're going to talk about next, we need to cover what a subsidy is. And a subsidy is basically when the government provides assistance to an organization or a company. So they might, loan money to a group to help them get going, or they might provide actual actual money to kind of feed the organization or business. And what we're going to see is after the Civil War, government subsidies are going to be used extensively to get the big transcontinental railroads off the ground. Remember, there's no profit being made building a railroad out in the middle of nowhere. So to encourage these railroads to actually build it, the government had to provide loans and also huge tracts of land given to these railroads. Now, the railroads are going to take a lot of that land that they're getting from the government as a subsidy, and once the railroad is built, that land becomes valuable, and they're going to sell this off to settlers. They're going to advertise here in America, advertise over in Europe, and try to encourage people to come out to the West, buy the land from the railroad. And of course, once these people move out west, the railroad's going to do even more business because you're going to have more farmers, more towns popping up. This can only get better for the railroads. Now, playing a big role in this is something we covered actually in period 5. That's the famous Homestead Act of 1862, which granted settlers 160-acre plots if they would agree to live on it for 5 years, do something to improve it, like, say, putting in a well or building a house, and paying a minor fee. All right, now let's talk about mining a little bit out west. We're going to get away from farming and talk about digging in the earth. Because remember, one of the reasons people are heading out west in the first place is there are a lot of natural resources to be found. And so what you would have is someone, you know, in an area out west would find gold, or they would find silver. And word would spread very quickly that, oh, this is the next big boom town. And so what would happen is almost overnight, a town would appear, and you would have almost like a tent city and houses going up left and right. And for a time, this city was just booming with more and more people coming in, more and more resources, more and more wealth. And then, of course, what happens is the claims start to play out. And that simply means they run out. There's only so much gold or silver in that deposit. And once it's all dug up, there's no reason to stay in this little town. And a good example of this would be Virginia City, Nevada. And in the 1860s, this city had over 15,000 people in it. It had newspapers, had an opera house. I mean, it was a booming city. In 2010, its population was 855. Okay, so there's not much left because the boom towns become ghost towns pretty quickly. I'll give you an example of one of these boom towns, which is still there. It's called Deadwood, South Dakota. This was a notoriously kind of rough frontier mining town where there's a lot of vigilante justice and shootouts and when you think of the Old West, all those tropes and stereotypes, that's what you think of with Deadwood. In fact, there was even a show made years back called Deadwood. This character down here, his name is Wild Bill Hickok. And Wild Bill Hickok was this famous lawman in the West and gunman, and he died in Deadwood. In fact, he's buried there. And odd trivia fact for you, I've been to Deadwood, and when you go there, if you want to see Wild Bill Hickok's gravesite, it's kind of a tourist attraction. When you go to the cemetery to go see his body, you actually have to pay admission to get into the cemetery, which I found kind of weird. All right, now, in the early days, miners, they're out panning for gold, or they've got their little cave or mine or whatever they're digging. But the stuff on the surface that's easily found is also, used up very, very quickly. So to get at the deeper deposits and the smaller pieces here and all that, it's going to require a lot of investment. So small-time miners are eventually kind of pushed out and replaced by big businesses, big corporations who can have, massive equipment, labor force, all that stuff to dig out all the silver and gold. Now, what are the effects of the mining? Well, obviously, when it was the Civil War time, we're going to see a lot of extra money in going into the Union to help them pay for the war and also to build the railroads. In fact, Nevada becomes a state during the Civil War, and Nevada is known as the Silver State because there's so much silver deposits. And one of the reasons Nevada was actually created as a state during the Civil War is that the Union wanted to basically have better oversight over Nevada. They didn't want it falling in the hands of the Confederacy because of all that currency that would have fallen into the hands of the Southern forces. Now, another effect is, of course, as we're going out west and looking for more gold and silver deposits, we're often trampling over lands that were set aside for the Indians. And so we're going to have kind of an intensity of white and Indian conflict out on the frontier. And we're going to look at this more in topic 6.3. In fact, we're going to look at a specific example where mining triggers a war. All right, on to the beef industry. This is going to be your last topic, guys. I know there's a lot of information in 6.2. Here we go, the beef industry. What's going on there? Well, think of the West. All those grasslands in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska. Those are prime places for raising cattle. And once those railroads are built that crisscross the continent, now all of a sudden you can get these cattle to market, right? You can ship them into the stockyards. They can be then processed and then shipped back out to consumers. That's where the refrigerated car comes in. It's a very important invention. And of course, to get the beef industry really, functioning, what you have to have are people to round up all the cattle. We call those people cowboys. And this is really kind of the heyday, the high point of cowboy mythology. And you think about how many movies and books and everything else, even music, has been dedicated to the cowboy. They really are an American character. It's something that, foreigners, when they think of America, they think of cowboys, right? Not that we're all cowboys, of course. And while we do think of the West as being settled largely by white people from the eastern part of the United States, there were lots of Hispanic and black settlers out west as well, and thousands of these cowboys were African American. And again, why do you think the cowboy is a cultural icon? I think it's just because cowboys are cool, right? I mean, they're independent, they're tough. They're carrying guns, and they just look like you don't want to mess with these guys. All right, now how you're going to get the cattle to market is, so think about the early transcontinental railroads. Most of them are going kind of east-west, and so you're going to have to drive the cattle from their grazing lands here in the south up to these towns, what are called railheads. And so you would march them over hundreds of miles up to the north, where then they'd be shipped out via the rail to bigger cities, primarily Chicago, which would be kind of over here, to then be turned into the meat that people across the country needed. All right, I know, guys, that was a ton of information I threw at you in 6.3, but there's a lot of important information. If you're going back and reviewing for, say, a quiz or test, definitely look over the Populists. Look over some problems facing farmers that led to the organization of things like the Populists and the Farmers Alliance and the grains and all that stuff. Look over mining and look over the cattle industry as well. Kind of go through and figure, okay, what happened because of mining? What happened because of the cattle drives and all that? Just look back over the big main ideas and be ready for some sort of assessment. All right, before we go, guys, as a preview, in our next video, 6.3, we are going to be covering westward expansion, but again, this time not focusing so much on farmers, but more so on what's going on with the Native Americans out west.